Speaker Tillis, thank you for being here today. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Well, as you know, this year's North Carolina Works series focuses on the economy. And it's no surprise that the recession has touched each and every North Carolinian, whether they're old or young, or rural or urban, or whether they're entrepreneurs or they work in a large corporation. It's touched everyone. So what we'd like to do with the time that we have with you today is focus on both the challenges and the opportunities that have arisen during this historic downturn. And we'd also like to talk about the shape that the recovery might take in the coming biennium. So to get us started on that, I was thinking we could look first at the role that you think the legislature might play in doing that.
I think that the legislature can play several different roles. What we've looked at literally since the elections, and certainly since we've been sworn in on January the 26th, are ways that we can break up what is a logjam in the business community and entrepreneurs and small businesses in taking risk, hiring people, betting on the fact that we can come out of this recession and ideally ahead of most other states. So ways that you do that: you provide certainty. In our opinion, you reduce the tax burden, and then you provide certainty about how that long-term tax obligation is going to have to look. It's a major factor in making long-term decisions, particularly around capital investment. The regulatory environment. What am I going to be confronted with as a small business to actually get into business and stay into business? The simpler and easier it is for small businesses to work and deal with regulatory bodies, the more likely they are to take risk and invest some of their own personal capital or get loans to do it. And then I think thirdly, how do we find other ways to stimulate innovation and risk-taking through new ways to incent businesses to relocate to North Carolina or expand existing operations? So what are we doing? We've made it clear that the temporary taxes that are set to expire at the end of June will. That means that income taxes, the larger number of income taxes, more than $300 million, will be returned to the private sector to stimulate investment. The sales tax will expire, which will produce more than another $1 billion in total, more than $1.5 billion going back into the private sector so that it can be deployed, in our opinion, more productively. If you do that in combination with other tax relief and with other regulatory relief, we believe that we have the opportunity to do something extraordinary here when a lot of other people are taking the easy out of saying, we'll balance the budget by raising taxes.
Okay. Well, you touched on just a moment ago the critical nature of North Carolina's small business. It's often been referred to as the backbone of the state's economy. So tell us a little bit about how North Carolina's small business has, in the long term, or whether it has been influenced more permanently by the recession, whether or not you see it being either reinvigorated by the challenges and opportunities or in some ways dampened?
I think we have the opportunity to reinvigorate it. I think it has been dampened, and a part of that is because we haven't made any progress on regulatory reform. I've been in the legislature for 2 terms. I'm beginning my 3rd term. Regulatory reform costs a lot of money. And it also, I think, causes risk-averse people to say, I'm just not going to get into it. If I'm going to get into a business or use a piece of property, pick an enterprise, and then I go about finding out what it is I need to do to get the proper permits or to lay the foundation for my business, most people are scared away just by the magnitude of the complexity in doing business in North Carolina. When we announced our regulatory reform committee, that's a joint House and Senate Select Committee going across the state looking for input, people immediately jumped to the thought that the Republicans were looking at purely environmental reform and that's all we were interested in. That's not the case. As a matter of fact, what we're looking for are all aspects of regulation that affects businesses and really even individuals, but certainly businesses. When you're a large corporation, you have a Department of Regulatory Affairs. You have trained attorneys and specialists that know how to deal with regulatory agencies. You said, and rightly so, that small businesses are the backbone of the economy. I would argue that they are the skeleton, that they go far beyond that. And by way of example, income taxes, corporate income taxes, about 400 corporations actually file corporate income taxes. About 460,000 of the total 4 million income tax returns that are filed on an individual basis report business income. So it's a huge number. Millions of people in business at one level or the other that's reported through personal income taxes. They're small businesses, 1, 2, 3, 4 people operations. So unlike that larger corporation that may have a regulatory affairs organization that can anticipate, be taught, and get through this process, and they need to be relieved, the small businessman who has to deal with a regulatory body may be spending weeks away from running his business, away from selling his products or services, and only focused on the regulatory component. If we can give people an idea that it will be easier to navigate and remove the risk associated with the uncertainty, we think that that alone could stimulate a lot of small business development.
Okay. Now, another key component, obviously, in North Carolina's economy has always been agriculture, but of course it's an industry in transition. So talk for a moment, if you will, about the investment in agribusiness, the shape that you see that it might take, and what its future, if you want to dust off your crystal ball, might look like.
Well, first, people need to understand that agribusiness, the historical view of agriculture and all the other industries that relate to it now, is an enormously important part of our economic current and future. I'm from Mecklenburg County. A lot of people probably do not realize this, but agriculture revenues from Mecklenburg County, an urban area, is one of the top 3 in the state, because we have a greenhouse industry and we have other agribusiness enterprises there that make it a significant player. So this isn't just about country versus city, rural versus urban. One of the things that we're looking at with the Commissioner of Agriculture are ways to actually make it easier. Some of it could be transitional strategies, moving from one crop mix to another one. Others go back to the regulatory construct that is required to get to farm and produce agricultural products. I think that the other things that we need to do is see how some of the historic industries begin to transition into the new economy. And if you take a look at the biotech campus over across the state, not far from where I live, and other enterprises, biofuels, and the extent, the striking the balance between agriculture for consumption and agriculture for inputs for energy, those sorts of things. We need to help people work through that and really make it easy for the transitions to occur, and to make sure that we've got a friendly market for these sort of transitional businesses.
Okay. And you mentioned just a moment that part of that transition was not just a matter of help for the rural communities, who some people think would carry most of the agribusiness weight. Let's talk a little bit about the weight of need and the weight of work for the rural and the urban communities. Statistics are telling us that the rural communities are bearing an enormous number of losses in the work sector, of course, in the job sector, and an enormous number of people disproportionately are living in poverty in those communities. So tell us a little bit about what you see might be a help to rural communities that have these additional challenges by virtue of their isolation from some of the engines of the economy.
I think first off, it's not urban versus rural. It's a balance. A part of what we have to do is restart the economic engines that are the urban crescent from Charlotte over to Raleigh and down into Fayetteville. That needs to go in combination with the focus on the rural areas of the state. We need to do those in combination. Neither can exist in a vacuum. The workforce for the economic engines in the urban centers oftentimes have people that come from rural areas. We have businesses and enterprises in rural areas that are part of the supplier base that come in and serve all these other businesses. So they're very much a part of a fabric that has to work together, or it's not sustainable. Now, with respect to things that we need to do differently, I think that some of the old models for how we prioritize funding, how we invest in any sort of economic development, those sorts of things really need to be looked at. And I'll tell you why. in certain areas, you have a great disparity. You may or may not know this, but there's a tiering system in place for the different counties, and based on the tier, there's a certain preference to the more impoverished areas, more depressed areas, to provide preference to them, which is a concept I agree with. But what we find out in some of these larger counties, Brunswick County is a classic example, where some people think of Brunswick County as beaches and high-end homes. Some of the poorest areas of the state are in Brunswick County. And those opportunities to help stimulate economic development in that rural area, Brunswick County, that needs help, has disproportionately high unemployment rates, can't be done because you say, whoops, as a whole, you're doing fairly well. So it overlooks the fact that if you looked on the ground, there's a problem there. And you also find that sometimes it crosses county lines. So Brunswick County may be in a less preferable tier or less depressed tier than an adjacent county, but the way it works now is you can't make those common sense decisions.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Well, now, obviously, in addressing some of these issues, whether it's jump-starting the engine, the economy, whether it's addressing individual needs, either in combination or individually, education is going to play a role in that, it would seem. So tell us a little bit about the role that you do think education might play in that, in whatever context you feel would be most important, whether it's K-12, university, community college, however you see that combination.
Well, there's a debate across the aisles about the tax and regulatory environment and how we feel like we could actually stimulate and increase North Carolina's stature by dealing with the tax burden and regulatory environment. And then the counter to that is, but we're still one of the preferred places for people to relocate. I tell you, without the university system and without our community college system, we would fall far from the first quartile in terms of attractive places to do business. So we've got a great workforce development infrastructure through our community college system, partnerships that they've done with businesses who relocate here already here, and the university system. I mean, our university system is extraordinary. And NC State and Chapel Hill alone, they generate almost $1.2 billion a year in federal grants because of the stature of those schools and the results they produce. They're job creators. Now, the question is, are they perfect? Are they spending the money in the right direction? Are they retooling for the future? Those are questions we're asking the chancellors, the community college presidents, and I will add the superintendents of schools. I had one in my office today, and of K through 12. What we're trying to do is figure out how we basically increase the inputs to each phase of the education cycle. K through 12, early childhood education, before a child actually gets into kindergarten. How do we improve those inputs through prioritizing development at the early childhood stages? Coming out of the high school, how do we improve inputs, and how do we have a better sense of what the right option is for that child or that young adult coming out of high school? Is it more appropriate to take the community college path and then go to a four-year college, to take the community college path and get a technical degree that can be immediately applied, or some combination thereof? That's what we're going to work on. But the university system, education system, is a great start, particularly in community college and universities. K through 12, I think you will see the new leadership in Raleigh try and find a different. There will be a lot of things that stay in place because they're good. Not everything in K through 12 is a problem, but you only have to look at the outcomes to know something has to be changed. And one of the things that we're doing is trying to work with school superintendents, with boards of education, with the NCAE and other teacher groups, and let's find out what we need to change on the ground to produce better outcomes, because we have historically increased spending on a per pupil basis and we've decreased outcomes, and those are two trend lines that we have to reverse.
Okay. Now, even as we talk about young people and getting them into the economy with the kind of background and support that they need, we also, as a state and a nation, are looking at the sudden and dramatic and historic growth of the number of people aged 65 and above. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, even though many of these older citizens are going to stay in the workplace even longer than they might have, say, 30 or 40 years ago, there are some challenges to this phenomenon that might have an impact on the state's economy. What opportunities do you see in the shift in this workplace demographic? With
respect to seniors, there are tremendous opportunities. First among them is give them an incentive not to go to Florida and live for 6 months in a day. And the reason why a number of retirees do that is because they have a more preferable tax environment in Florida with respect to income, and it makes no sense to live here no matter how badly they want to. So a part of what we want to do is make North Carolina, in the same way that we want to be competitive with new businesses relocating here, we also want to be competitive with a segment of society that tends to have a disproportionately lower requirement from the infrastructure for the income that they represent. So that's first and foremost. How do we become a more friendly place for people to retire and live their senior years here? By the same token, and you already see this in community colleges, how do you also let them retool and continue to be a productive part of the workforce? And you already see that in some community colleges. It's amazing to see the average age now and the changes in the demographic in community colleges. I think we have to do more things to allow these seniors who are healthy, they're vibrant, they want to work, they want to remain active, and give them the same sort of training and work skills development capabilities that we're trying to provide for the younger population just coming out of school.
Well, we've talked about so many different sections of North Carolina's economy and its constituents and citizens. What are your summary thoughts about looking ahead, emerging from the economic downturn, and providing for the state's workers?
Well, for the state's workers, are we talking about the state employees? Or the workers across the state?
Across the state, citizens.
Well, you know, I think a part of what we want to do is put more money in their pocket and more opportunities for them to go out and enjoy the fruits of their labor. We want to get them employed at higher numbers. We have got to create private sector jobs. I think if we learn nothing else over the last 2 years, that some of the projects, though they were well-intentioned and they provided some temporary relief, they didn't solve the fundamental problem. So stimulus funds and other sources of relief funds did not produce a long-term sustainable benefit by and large. Were there some? Sure. Did they help us live pay to paycheck or pay the rent, you know, for a year or so? Yes. But we still have the fundamental problem that we have not cracked the nut on private sector job development. And we do that by working with the private sector, working with the job creators in the private sector, and come up with a different way for them to do business in North Carolina. I'm very excited. It's a bit early, but maybe I can come back and talk about it in about a month. But the citizens need to understand a little bit about the process. April the 18th is actually tax day this year because of the date that the tax day falls on. The money reports, the availability, will then come out to the General Assembly sometime around the end of April. And what we're doing right now are preparatory steps for what we will unveil as a part of our strategy for job creation. A part of what influences that is to what extent do we have funds available, to the extent that we will be expending funds for job creation, or more likely come in the form of other tax relief or incentive constructs. So I'm excited about that, because then I can answer your question more specifically about 3 or 4 areas that I think will be unique in approach, at least in the 4 years that I've been here, and by most people's measures, dozens of years, the emphasis on private sector sustainable job creation.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, we'll have to have you back then.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.